In many ways, the history of Nosgoth is defined by the conflict between the humans and the vampires. With their shared ancient history long forgotten, successive groups of vampire hunters sprang up to combat vampire threats to human populations, each attempting to finally wipe out the undead scourge of the vampire menace once and for all. This time on the Arcane Tomes, we'll be examining some of these vampire hunting orders, continuing with the most successful of the vampire hunting orders, Moebius's mercenary army. The People's Army, sometimes known as Moebius's mercenary army, or simply the Vampire Hunters, were a ragtag order of mercenaries under the command of the time streamer Moebius. The order was heavily associated with the timeline change of the first paradox, which exchanged the dominant legions of the Nemesis for the vampire hunters of the People's Army. The order appeared in 3 of the games and was a dominant force from the pre-Blood Omen era to the post-Blood Omen era, and was successful in reducing vampire numbers to a single survivor. The People's Army first appeared in Blood Omen Legacy of Kain, as Kain investigated the time manipulations of Moebius the Time Streamer, and discovered that he had influenced William the Just into becoming the tyrant the Nemesis that would lay waste to Nosgoth. Seeking to remove the Time Streamer's influence, Kain travelled to the land of the Nemesis and killed William before he could become the Nemesis, using a time-streaming device to reach the past and a twin Soul Reaver paradox to change history. When he returned to his own time, he was assailed by highly skilled vampire hunters, but only when he reached the rampart outside Stauberg would he realise his mistake. Kain arrived just in time to witness the execution of Vorador, leaving him the last of the vampires left in Nosgoth. Kain defeated Moebius and the hordes of the vampire hunters, but the manipulation to rid the world of vampires no doubt played a role in his subsequent decision at the Pillars. The mercenary army and a successor branch of demon hunters appeared in Soul Reaver 2, when Raziel travelled back in time to the pre-Blood Omen era to pursue Kain. Raziel first arrived in the Seraphan stronghold, and was greeted by Moebius, who explained that his order inhabited the stronghold in this era. Alongside Seraphan iconography, he found those of the vampire hunters, and was forced to battle them to escape the fortress, and through the land as a whole. When he travelled to the future of the post-Blood Omen era, Raziel found that the humans of that era sported heavy armour marked with a familiar symbol. These were demon hunters, descendants of Moebius's army, who had adapted to combat new demonic threats in an era with few vampires and more demonic incursions, thanks to the weakened dimensional boundaries caused by the collapse of the Pillars. Defiance featured the last appearance of the vampire hunters. As Raziel arrived in the Blood Omen era, they were his primary human enemies. As with the other enemy classes, the Defiance classes sported more specialisms than had been shown previously, but they remained a constant threat through Raziel's chapters. The history of the mercenary army could be considered to stretch all the way back to the time of the Ancients, and the period before Nosgoth recorded history, with Moebius's encounters overthrowing the ancient vampires, or to Nosgoth's early history and the Crusades of the Seraphan, which were sponsored and led for a time by Moebius. However, the true beginning of the Order was in the pre-Blood Omen era, with a visit by Moebius to the land of the Nemesis. Along the way, Moebius campaigned to win the approval of the subjects of the fair King William the Just, giving a rousing speech, warning them of an oncoming onslaught. Gaining an audience with William, Moebius explained that his goal was to protect the king, and warn him of oncoming threats, including a vampire assassin sent to kill him. In the first timeline seen in the series, William would survive this attempt on his life, and, manipulated by Moebius and the power of the Soul Reaver, he would found the legions of the Nemesis to decimate Nosgoth. However, later timelines would see Kain kill William in their battle, and instead of founding the legions of the Nemesis, William died a martyred saint, and Moebius exploited the grief of William's subjects and rage at the vampire assassin to ignite a renewed vampire purge. In the years after, Moebius built a powerful force of mercenaries that formed a formidable fighting force and drastically lowered vampire numbers. They built upon and expanded a rampart south of Stahlberg, which became their main execution ground, and they occupied the Seraphan stronghold, potentially rebuilding or installing some of its tributes to the Seraphan. After decades of emulating their Seraphan predecessors, the mercenary army achieved what the Seraphan could not. Their crusades became so dominant that they were able to round up the last of the era's vampires. One by one, the vampires were executed in the Stahlberg rampart. Kain arrived just in time to witness the execution of Vorador, leaving him as the last vampire in Nosgoth. A fact which Moebius pointed out to the baying crowds.
He is the last! Destroy him!
Kain managed to defeat the vampire hunters and Moebius's champion, as well as several illusions or time-travelled warriors, including warriors of the Seraphan and a supposed future version of Kain himself, before he killed Moebius, the time streamer. The vampire hunters were now leaderless, but the damage had been done, and Kain was left the sole surviving vampire in Nosgoth. Ordinarily, this might be the end of the story, but even with the virtual elimination of the vampire race, the history of the vampire hunters didn't end there. With the collapse of the pillars, the boundaries between dimensions were weakened, and a new threat began to emerge as demons were able to cross into the material realm from the demon realm. This new threat caused the vampire hunters to adapt, and they changed their tactics and became more heavily armoured, transitioning to become demon hunters. By this time they had abandoned the decaying Seraphan stronghold, although they left the last tribute to Moebius's victory. Like their forebears, what caused the downfall of the People's Army and the demon hunters is not well documented. However, it would appear that much of their activity was dependent upon demon incursions, and a few centuries after the fall of the Pillars, the demon attacks began to subside, and at least in the most recent incarnation of the timeline, began to formalize around a renewed Hildren presence in the material realm. The legacy of the vampire hunters is something of a mixed bag. Whereas the Seraphan Crusades were generally lionized by the humans and referenced for centuries afterwards, the purges of Moebius's army were apparently not as fondly remembered, despite being more successful in their goals of wiping out the vampires. The most obvious legacy of the vampire hunters was the dramatic drop in the number of vampires, as the Order left only one vampire, Kain, alive, and presumably this meant a change in the effects on the human populace. However, the destruction of the vampires did influence Kain, as he soon found himself facing a monumental decision to sacrifice himself to restore the Pillars, or refuse and rule Nosgoth in its damnation. Kain himself referenced that the effects of that decision, being to effectively completely wipe out the vampire race, was highly influential in his choice to refuse the sacrifice and find another way. For many years afterward, the vampire population would remain perilously low. Indeed, in most iterations of Nosgoth's history, Kain would remain the only survivor for centuries until his raising of the Sarafan lieutenants and the establishment of his empire 5 centuries after the collapse of the Pillars. Only in the most recent iteration of history did vampire populations recover sooner, with the resurrection of Vorador and his creation of Kain's vampire army. However, this soon returned to slimmer numbers under the threat of the Hilden-backed new Sarafan Order, and it's unclear if many of the vampires survived to see the founding of Kain's empire. The success of the demon hunters is unclear. They were only seen in one era that was apparently overrun by demons, set a century after the collapse of the Pillars. And while demons seem to remain a threat for the next 4 centuries at least, their attacks at that time seemed less prevalent and were restricted to largely uninhabited areas. This could be a sign that the demon hunters were effective, or merely that the demon threat coalesced around the Hilden incursion. In any case, the mercenary army in its history was subject to less tribute and lionization than its Sarafan predecessors, and only a single memorial to the order was apparent, with a statue commemorating the execution of Vorador found in the ruined Sarafan stronghold in the post-Blood Omen era. Although other statues of Moebius could be found in the Chronoplast and the Eternal Prison, which could be considered to pay tribute to his exploits, though neither specifically referenced his army. Ironically enough, Moebius and the People's Army could be the ones responsible for the lionization of the Sarafan and construction of monuments to honour them, as they seem to occupy all the places where such commemoration occurs, although this is not conclusively proven. In the far future of the Soul Reaver era, stories of the People's Army and their Sarafan forebears would serve as inspiration for the human resistance to Kain's rule, and ultimately led to the formation of a new faction of vampire hunters. As with other orders, Moebius's army has a distinct leadership structure and a number of different troops which appear in the games, each with different roles in battle. First and foremost, the most important character in the formation of the Order is Moebius himself. The Time Guardian was one of the leaders of the original human rebellion against the ancient vampires, and was one of the sponsors of the Sarafan Crusades several centuries later. And he was once again responsible for anti-vampire sentiments in the formation of the People's Army. At this stage, it's almost as if he's taking orders from a hidden entity with an anti-vampire agenda. He formed the People's Army after the murder of William the Just, capitalising on the grief and outrage of William's subjects against the vampire assassin, and led the Order to virtually wipe out the vampires before he was murdered by the last vampire, Kain. The People's Army carried on after Moebius, with the vampire hunters becoming demon hunters in the process. Moebius was lionized in several places, including the Oracle's Cave network and the Eternal Prison, but perhaps the most relevant likeness was featured in the Sarafan stronghold, where a statue of Moebius held aloft Vorador's severed head, commemorating the victory of these vampire hunters. Besides Moebius, the only characters we know with any particular reference or relevance are seen in Blood Omen, with one character, Vorador's Executioner, who is named in sources as the Executioner and the Leader, potentially implying that at the highest levels of authority, there may be a relationship like the Sarafan had with the Circle, in that part of the Circle, or at least Moebius himself, sponsored the activities of the Order, while its true day-to-day leader was an unnamed pawn of Moebius. Another apparently singular figure in the mercenary army is Moebius's champion. He is prominently featured among the figures present at Vorador's execution, and is later encountered in Moebius's boss battle, where he is fought where Moebius summons enemies to represent him from the present. Here, he is encountered as a sole enemy that is unique and unusually powerful, suggesting him as something of a champion of the Order. The rest of the known members of the Orders are treated as regular enemies with classes that vary between games, and are largely classified by their appearance, weaponry, and attack range. Soul Reaver 2 showed the mercenaries in the earliest period, with the following troops. These are Vampire Hunter swordsmen. They're close-ranged fighters, armed with falchion swords. These are Vampire Hunter pikemen, armed with halberds and specialising in mid-range combat. And these are the long-range Vampire Hunter cannoneers, who fire cannonball projectiles from hand cannons, and appear to be visually identical to the swordsmen. There are also these Vampire Hunter attack dogs. They accompany their human masters into battle, and are used to help detect and seek vampire enemies. Though relatively weak, their speed and agility can make them dangerous foes. Blood Omen and Defiance showed the mercenary army 30 years later. But although different troops were shown, it's not clear if there was any change or evolution in the roles like there had been with the Sarafan, and they still seem to be something of a ragtag collection of different groups. In Blood Omen, you could find these stake wielders, who covered mid-ranges. You could find these sickle wielders, who covered long ranges with extendable scythes. And you could find these torch wielders, who covered short ranges. Defiance played similar variations to those of Soul Reaver 2, although a little more colourfully described. These were the Vampire Hunter pillagers. When pressed, they could attack by rolling and striking with claws, but were more likely to hang back and throw firebombs from a distance. Vampire Hunter mercenaries were mid-ranged attackers who used two-pronged polearms. Vampire Hunter sorceresses were the mages of the group. They tended to hang back and summon spells to buff allies, such as regeneration, amplify damage, and TK shield. But they could also summon glyph shields to protect themselves, throw fireballs, initiate a radial blast, and teleport at will. Vampire Hunter juggernauts were large, powerful, and tough enemies that attacked using a heavy hammer that often formed a major target. Perhaps the rarest Vampire Hunter class were the agile Vampire Hunter ascetics that appeared later on in Defiance. They appeared to be visually almost identical to their pillager counterparts, but moved much quicker, with a dancing style resembling real-world capoeira. When the Vampire Hunters transitioned into Demon Hunters, comparatively little was known about their leadership and organisation, with most of the known leadership apparently killed at the end of Blood Omen. The Demon Hunters all wore the same identical all-covering heavy armour, and variants were distinguishable only by the weaponry they used, although the division of classes somewhat resembled the early Soul Reaver 2 version of the Order. The close-range attackers were the Demon Hunter swordsmen, armed with the same heavy falchion swords as their vampire hunter predecessors. The mid-range was covered by the demon hunter axemen, who were armed with slow but powerful heavy axes. At long range, the demon hunters were protected by the demon hunter cannoneers, who fired cannonball projectiles from hand cannons, much like their vampire hunter forebears. The demon hunters were also bolstered by the use of canine allies, and utilised demon hunter attack dogs, although they were noticeably of a different breed to their vampire hunting predecessors, and were kitted out with different weaponry. In contrast to the pious, orderly and uniformed appearance of the Sarafan, the vampire hunters of the People's Army were always intended to be a bit more of a ragtag cutthroat militia than an organised army. As such, their appearance generally reflects the more undisciplined lone wolf nature of its participants, with troops dressed in varying loose costumes, with few truly resembling a unified military uniform or armour set, at least until the appearance of demons in the years after the collapse of the Pillars forced an apparent change in tactics and a switch to a more defensive armour. The vampire hunters are similarly given less noble motivations than their Sarafan predecessors. In the case of the Sarafan, a powerful, devoutly religious ideology was at work, and only in its latter stages was greed and repression part of the modus operandi. However, for the vampire hunters, greed and a lack of moral scruples were the very basis of the order, as is hinted by the frequent use of the term mercenaries. The combatants were paid to be there, and often joined for the love of the brutality associated with the cause. Sources frequently describe the army as sleazy, vicious, and driven. In a similar vein, the appearance and behaviour of the mercenary army is noted by developers to be inspired by far-right political movements, and are particularly linked to fascism and Nazism, with numerous acknowledged references, imagery, and intended parallels, some of which also applies to the legions of the Nemesis. The initial speech where Moebius rallies the citizens of the land of the Nemesis, a scene which led to the formation of both factions in different timelines, is openly acknowledged in behind-the-scenes text to be deliberately reminiscent of the Nuremberg rallies, with Moebius described as Hitler-esque, and the scene is even named as Nuremberg in scripts and stage directions. Similar intolerance is also evident in further background sources, with the People's Army described as considering all unusual and unfamiliar people guilty until proven innocent, and are not reluctant to murder social deviants. The symbol of Moebius's mercenary army is an hourglass defaced with an eye and torch. This would appear to be a reference to Moebius's pillar token, the hourglass, as well as the design of the Pillar of Time. However, later games would seem to imply that the eye symbol may be representative of the Elder God. The symbol itself is described by Raziel as unmistakable. In the later periods of the Demon Hunters, the banners of the Order are all shown in tatters, but a more crude version of the symbol, which appears hand-drawn, can be seen on the waist sash of the Demon Hunters. We've already talked about the unique character of Moebius's champion seen in Blood Omen. Interestingly enough, it seems that the champion did not start out as a unique enemy, and in early versions of the game, he's fought as a regular enemy, with several being able to be fought at once. Another cut class from Blood Omen are these water balloon wielding vampire hunters. They weren't present in the final game, but they could still be found in the background code. The alpha development builds also revealed that this class was more prevalent in early builds, being fought as a regular enemy, and they were mostly found in parts of the ruined Nemesis Keep that ended up on the cutting room floor. Aside from the Blood Omen vampire hunters, numerous concept arts and early designs for the vampire hunters could be found in bonus materials and artist portfolios. For the latter games, these appear to be much the same as retail, with only minor changes, such as subtle colour changes, which could be down to the in-game lighting. However, there are at least 2 designs which appear to show cut classes that were not implemented in any fashion. One, a darker interpretation of the hunters for Soul Reaver 2. The other, a short dwarf-like enemy planned for Defiance. Finally, the statue of Moebius holding aloft the severed head of Vorador, the ultimate symbol of the eradication of the vampires, was initially planned to have a deeper symbology as the womb of their rebirth, as the initial outlines for Defiance featured the long-fabled resurrection of Vorador. In these early plans, Raziel was intended to meet a human vampire worshipper Uma, who would send him on a quest to recover the head from Moebius' statue, with the head revealed to literally be the real severed head of Vorador. At the end of the quest, Vorador would be resurrected, and Uma would be turned into a vampire as a reward for her actions, thus mending the final loose continuity threads of Blood Omen 2. Unfortunately, the developers decided that resurrecting Vorador and Janos in the same game seemed redundant, and so the issue was pushed back. And with later cancellations, it remains unresolved to this day. The Mercenary Army has a number of alternative titles. The title perhaps most used to name the order is the simple, but rather imprecise, Vampire Hunters, a term that could apply to many other vampire hunting orders, and is directly used for at least one of the other later vampire hunting orders. Other terms frequently used to refer to the order include Moebius' Mercenary Army or Moebius' People's Army, and variants thereof. Although fulfilling something of a canon grey area, cancelled multiplayer spin-off Nosgoth contains several minor references to Moebius' hunters, with it once again implied that the humans battling in the war for Nosgoth were heavily inspired by them, and some of these classes were obvious precursors to the vampire hunters later seen in Soul Reaver. We hope you've enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and join us next time, when we'll look at the vampire hunting successors of Moebius' hunters, and another Seraphan order.